Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Guidelines for Building a Test Automation Coverage Strategy. Before we begin, I'd like to cover 3 housekeeping items for our viewers. First, at the bottom of your audience console, you'll find a number of widgets for questions and additional resources. When you have a question for the presenters during the webcast, click on the Q&A widget and submit your question. We will answer as many questions as possible at the end of the webcast, and if we run out of time, we'll get back to you via email. Second, if you need any tech support during the webinar, please use the help option. Third and finally, a copy of today's slide deck is available in the resources section at the bottom of your screen. We will also email you a link to the recording of this webinar within the next few hours. With that, I'll pass it off to one of our presenters for today's broadcast, Eran Kinsbruner, Chief Evangelist here at Perfecto by Perforce. Eran, thanks for joining us on today's broadcast.
Thank you, Shelby. Truly excited to deliver today's webinar. Test coverage is one of the, I would say, hottest and most exciting topics that I have been dealing with over the past few years. So I'm truly excited to be here, but not alone. I'm here co-presenting with my colleague, Erik Fogg from ProdPerfect. Hi, Erik. How are you?
Hey. I'm doing great. I've been looking forward to this one for a long time, and I know we've got some really good meaty stuff to dive into for everyone today.
Do you want to just say a word about yourself and ProdPerfect just before we start?
Yeah, of course. So I'm a founder at ProdPerfect. At ProdPerfect automatically builds, maintains, and evolves end-to-end regression test suites for web applications. So that's what our team does. We're based out of Boston and San Francisco. We've been around for 2.5 years. Obviously not as long as you guys, but we've been really excited for kind of what the future looks like for a partnership with Perfecto, of course, and I think we've got a lot of like strong opinions on how to do testing right that I'm excited to share with you all today.
Awesome, Erik. And to your comment on your bio, you are pretty smart. I definitely, I work with you on this webinar. You are pretty smart. In today's webinar, we're going to touch a few interesting topics. We're definitely going to talk about, the digital reality and how digital and test coverage and agile kind of come together. We're going to talk a bit about how test automation gets in the way of maintaining test automation coverage continuously, obviously. And then we're going to provide, with the help of Erik and ProdPerfect, some nice practices and guidelines on how to build a test automation coverage strategy and also how to maintain it as your product and roadmap evolves, but also as the market shifts. Throughout this webinar and also at the end, feel free to ask us any questions that you might have. We'll try to address as many as we can during this webinar. Whatever remains unanswered, we will touch base with you after the webinar. So I would like to start with today's reality, okay? We are fully digital. Digital is one of the key business models today for organizations, enterprises, small businesses to engage with the end users, whether it is from a web application or a mobile application or both. And if your digital strategy and digital apps aren't in sufficient quality, obviously your end users are going to suffer. So this is why you want to have a very good test automation strategy for the digital space, but also you want to have a good test automation coverage that can keep up with everything that goes on. With that in mind, Erik, are you seeing also a better shift or more emphasis on digital today?
I mean, we're to address the elephant in the room. We're obviously doing this webinar in a very trying time for everyone across the world, and it's in, to say the obvious, it's in a time where in-person interactions are unsafe and, digital interactions are much safer. And I think so what we've seen very recently, here at ProdPerfect at least, is that there's a huge spike in demand for greater automated testing from a lot of these, from a lot of digital services that are alternatives to in-person services. So e-learning, delivery, e-commerce, remote workforce management apps, and team collaboration applications. And I honestly believe that that we're going to see a permanent shift towards greater utilization of all of these digital tool sets throughout our lives. In part because they work really well. I think we again, as much as the coronavirus has been extremely difficult and tragic for us, we are lucky to have had a growing digital space for a lot of what we need to do to function as society. And I think that over this next year, we're going to see a lot of those services entrench themselves and become bigger and more vital parts of all of our lives. That's what that has meant is a truly kind of substantial pressure on a lot of these digital services to provide more services more quickly at a radical level of both product quality and load load bandwidth and performance quality. And it's been really exciting to play a small part in helping that.
Definitely. And I think it connects pretty well into how you actually deliver software in a digital reality. And to deliver, digital quality, you need to have an optimized delivery pipeline to enable you to innovate fast, release high quality, valuable features to your end users, obviously in a short amount of time with an efficiency cost. And what we've seen is obviously that the ability to shift your test automation left and gaining insights from production, so you are testing on the right platforms, the right test automation scenarios as early as possible. These are key fundamentals to deliver high and robust quality applications. Obviously, when you are working in siloed approaches, you are missing a lot. You are losing touch with the different counterparts in the organization, and obviously you are moving slower and risking with escape defects. And if you want to double click on this slide and see what we at Perfecto, and I'm sure that ProdPerfect are seeing more or less the same, we're seeing these following 9 or 10 key pain points, and some of them are actually correlating to each other, or some of them are actually the root cause of other pains.
Yes.
So if I give you an example, not having the right automation skill set within the organization, but you are forcing these guys to create test automation, results, as you can see on the slide, in test maintenance and lack of digital platform coverage, or it lacks the ability to automate advanced test automation scenarios, or you are not meeting your release timeline. So these are some of the common pain points we see in test automation that at the end of the day, 100% correlate to problems that you have in test automation and platform coverage. Anything you've seen that relates to your daily insights, Erik?
Yeah, of course. So I think ultimately, there's to your point, the causes of problems with quality and deployment are myriad, and we're going to be, of course, talking through some of the strategic insights that we have about how to address these. But I think a big part of I think if there's a theme of all these problems, it's resource and scope mismatch, right? So what I think I see very often among test automation teams is a scope of work that doesn't match the resources of those individuals to be able to build and maintain, or a scope of tests, especially at the end-to-end level or at the device level, where running these takes a much larger amount of resources, and then we'll get to kind of that difference later. But where we see a scope of testing that's asked for that doesn't match the bandwidth or strength of the test environment, it doesn't match the time that's allocated in the software development lifecycle for that testing to happen, and these fundamental mismatches. These fundamental mismatches are where we start to run into problems. And so a big part of getting the strategy right is right-sizing the scope, and how we do that without sacrificing quality is a big part of what we're going to talk about today.
Definitely. And I think a teaser for the next couple of slides is, making the test automation coverage properly and continuously fit where we are or where you are in your product lifecycle needs to be the right balance between the scope, as Erik just mentioned, the scope of what you want to test. This is what you see on the right hand, the test scenarios themselves, against the right platform coverage. Which desktop browsers against which operating systems, which mobile devices against which mobile operating systems, and both are actually two sides of the same coin, which is your end user experience, the digital quality. With that, Erik, I want to hand it over to you to show us the big picture.
Yeah, thanks, Eran. As we sort of started to allude to early in this problem space that we saw, is that we've got a fundamentally like limited amount of time and resources to be able to create a digital experience for the customer that's going to work for them. And so the way I think about, the way they're going to think about all this content that we're going to be walking through today is that there are two big takeaways that you should have, if nothing else, right? So those of you taking notes, right, these are the two things. Everything else is a subcategory of these. And the first of these is that we need to prioritize everywhere, right? So across all the different dimensions that we need to test our application, we need to prioritize what our scope is going to look like so that we can match it to our resources, our money, our team, our time in the SDLC, our resources in our test environments, platforms, and devices. And we can do this with data, right? I've seen a lot of teams prioritize with their best instincts, with their best judgment, with their experience, and they're really robbing themselves of the opportunity to bring good data into the decision making about how to prioritize what we're going to test. And ultimately, that lack of data is often kind of the subroot of where we start to get scope creep or misscoping or mistesting in the test environment. And the reasons we have to make these tough priority decisions are that obviously we have very limited resources in our team for testing, actually for software development and digital development as a whole. It's not just that, the free market exerts pressure on us to move quickly and do more with less. It's that fundamentally, I think even now, software engineers are in very high demand. There's frankly only so much talent to go around, and squandering these resources on low priority activities is ultimately just going to hold you back. Our time is probably the part that's most limited for us. So in particular, as we see the market shift towards one where even businesses that are not conventionally digital need to move quickly to digital to survive. Time, I think, is shorter than it's ever been, but it's always been the case that time to market has probably been the primary pressure in the software world, or at least in the web software world. And so what it means is that we can only go through so many testing cycles before we get our application out to our customers. And as we're thinking about how we prioritize, how we use both our time and our human and capital resources, the thing that we should be focusing all of them on is customer value. And what that means is that most of this time and resources should be deployed towards creating features and functionality that the customer values. Ultimately, if we think of kind of old Toyota Lean or Six Sigma methodologies, they actually think of testing as not value added. And the reason for that isn't because testing is not valuable, but because if we didn't have to test, we could put all of our resources into creating customer value, right? So any resource we're pulling away from creating features towards testing is testing that's not creating something that the customer wants. And that forces hardcore prioritization decisions that testing strategists need to make. I've talked a lot. Eran, anything you want to add to that?
I think that this is perfect. Just one word about data and prioritization. One smart guy once told me that quality is like a moment in time. Okay, you're testing it today. You know where you are today, but in a week or 2 weeks or 3 months from the moment you've seen something, it's actually irrelevant anymore. This is why you actually need this high scale data and prioritization to guide you through your next steps. And obviously doing it manually or doing it on your own is quite almost impossible.
Yes. And that touches on our time point a little bit, where what we ultimately want to see when we're when we're building web and mobile software, what we ultimately want to be able to do is, because testing is so momentary, we want to be able to test with very high frequency, right? Because changes are happening so quickly. We want to be able to test over and over and over again. And this means that the tests that we are running need to be right sized to that high frequency. If our test suite takes 3 days, 5 days to run, or it takes a very high level of capital resources to run, we can't run it with the frequency that we need to be able to, as Eran mentioned earlier, shift testing left and get that feedback to developers much quicker. And a lot of the reasons that this is so hard to get right, remember Eran talked through these different problems that we see, and and my big take on that is about scoping, is that knowing that we need to prioritize what tests we're going to deploy, or at least what tests we're going to run at a given time. What's common to see in quality assurance teams is we'll assign priorities to tests, right? This is a priority 1 test, priority 2 test, etc. But what counts as priority 1 and priority 2 is something that if you took 2 talented quality assurance teams and had them look at the same application, the same set of requirements, those 2 different teams would produce different prioritization metrics, and therefore different priorities of what to test, right? So team 1 would create this set of tests as priority 1, team 2 would create a different one. And what that ultimately means is that there's a lot of subjectivity and experience and art form going into these decisions. And what that means is that we're not going to have an optimal outcome. And what we ultimately know that we want to do when we're building these tests is test to make sure that the user experience is what we want it to be, which means what we really care about is knowing how our users use the application and making sure that those ways of using it work, right? That should always be our top priority, and it's what we're always trying to do. But doing it without data, we can get frankly lost and end up testing the application in a lot of ways that our users aren't actually using it. And therefore waste a lot of those very precious, limited time and human and capital resources. But the good news, of course, is that the data is out there. And we can use that data both from an aggregate across the industry and from our own applications individually to help us understand what is a top priority feature or experience for our users. Right? And with that data, we can focus our testing on what our users care about most. What workflows are they going through and how? What devices and browsers are they using? What environmental conditions are they working in? What data sets are they using? What load are they running through, right? Where are they in the world? All these things we know, we're able to collect that, and therefore we're able to utilize that data to make sure that our testing matches our users' priorities, and we can develop a testing strategy where the user comes first and the user tells us what matters to them. Eran, anything you want to add?
No, I think data. This is what test engineers, developers need, especially when you talk about digital user journeys, user experience, focusing and optimizing the pipeline as you try to shift left your testing. I think this is spot on.
Yes. And one way of looking at it before I turn it over back to Eran here is when we think about all these different axes on which we're prioritizing, right? So which workflows or features in our application, which browsers, which devices, which environments, which geos. What we're almost always going to see across each of these axes is a head and a long tail. So the green is the head, the yellow is the long tail of the experience. So, for example, with browsers, there are going to be a couple browsers most of our customers use very frequently, and a bunch of browsers that are used infrequently. Actually, probably better for this is like devices, right? There'll be a few mobile devices that we're using, a whole bunch of mobile devices that are being used very infrequently. And it's by understanding this head and tail structure that we can use that data to make decisions. And generally speaking, green, since we have to prioritize, green is what we should be testing, and yellow is what we should be making lower priority, either testing less frequently or not at all. And there's two ways of thinking about this. We can either decide, hey, we're going to test up to a certain percentage of our users, which is where we have this sort of vertical line. Everything to the left of this line will test, or we can draw a line horizontally where we say anything that is a certain frequency or higher, right? So anything that's used, any workflow that's used or any device that's used above a certain frequency, we're going to make a top priority. And that way we have an objective methodology by which we're deciding what's high priority, what's low priority, and that problem of having two different teams come in and come up with two different sets of priorities now goes away, and we get a better customer experience.
Thanks, Erik. I think that the previous slide was amazing. It's simple, and it's exactly what I've been using over the past few years to build this, what we call the test coverage index report, looking at the, I would say, the most important top must test devices and browsers, and the long tail, which is, if you can think about it like the emerging new devices. For example, Apple are now working on iOS 13.5 beta. Android 11 is in third beta. Last week, Apple released an iOS phone device, iPhone SE, which is also new. Obviously, you will not see it in your analytics report because it's very, very new with a very minimal usage. It doesn't mean that it's not going to be important as we grow. It's in the long tail, but it's still important. So all of these things that I've just said are in the bucket of considerations in the strategy that you think about when you combine your platform test automation coverage. So in this first section of these slides, I'm just going to focus. I'm going to really give you examples from the digital market, from the landscape that we are testing and living in, which is the mobile and desktop web platforms. And then I will move more towards the test automation scoping, the scenarios themselves. So if you look at this slide, you see three different layers: the essential coverage, the enhanced, and the extended. And as you can see, obviously the long tail consists of, I would say, 22 devices. Okay, one aggregates the other. So the top 10, this is the most important chunk for you to prioritize and focus on when you are doing mobile application test automation. The top 10 most used devices. This is what we recommend in our report based on, as Erik mentioned earlier, tons of data, usage data, market data, and other testing considerations. But this entire set of considerations needs to be properly divided in your development lifecycle. If you think about a software iteration will include different phases, right? In the first phase, where the developer is writing the code and implementing a story point or other functionality, or if he's just fixing a bug, he will work on his local environment where he will need to test only on a very small subset of platforms, maybe a simulator or emulator, or maybe just one or two browsers, because the coverage in this scenario isn't that important. The functionality of the new code that was included or integrated takes priority here.
Yes.
Obviously, when you shift right, this is where you want to extend the scope of both your testing as well as your platform to understand the differences in user experience, performance, functionality, as different platforms have different characteristics. What do you think about that, Erik?
Yeah, it's what I love about the extra layer of sophistication that you're bringing in here is that, if we think back to that head and tail slide, it feels very binary at first look, where we say, okay, if it's above this line, it's in. If it's below this line, forget it, it's out. Where what we're seeing emerge here from the data, right? And the data is what drives the strategy. What we're seeing emerge from this data is the ability to have a strategy where we're able to prioritize higher frequency types of testing further left and lower frequency types of testing further right along the SDLC that have different priorities, right? That serve different functions and needs. And what that allows us to do is not have to compromise ultimately on quality versus speed, right? We can't have, due to our limitations, we can't have a world where we're testing, at both maximum frequency and maximum scope. But by using the data to help us understand what types of testing we should be doing in this, high speed, high frequency, far left testing, what types of testing we should be doing much further right. We're able to make sure that we're able to achieve this kind of like mythical concept of total test coverage in a sane way that allows us to continue to move fast and efficiently with our software team.
Definitely. Thanks, Erik. And by the way, when we are saying head and tail, when we're saying the top 10 devices, it doesn't mean that these devices are not important. Actually, they are very, very important because they are sometimes showing, in some cases, that's a mix, okay? And it depends on your analytics as well. Some customers are gathering their own data and analytics. However, when you think about an additional, in this case for the mobile coverage strategy, an additional 22 devices that you are now ignoring or reprioritizing, this is something that you do want to look into because this list will include, as you can see in the description, devices that are just new and emerging, like the new iPhone SE, or yes, it can be devices that currently are with lower usage, but it might change going forward. So you want to be definitely on top of these analytics, on these reports, so you can fine-tune your coverage and maybe expand as you grow your product strategy. And by the way, it's not just data and usage that we are requiring. If you just look at, the raw data that is out there, this is nothing that I'm inventing. This is what the Google Play and the App Store are providing us for free. And you can see the market is very, very fragmented on the mobile front. I will soon touch on the web as well. And you can see different operating systems. I'm looking here at least 6 Android operating system families and at least 3. And we're just entering the iOS 14 era, which will be the 4th operating system family. So just by talking about 4 and 6, I just reached the top 10 coverage or devices that I want to think of. But it's not that simple, because when you think about 6 operating system families on Android, these are just the stock operating systems. It's just, let's say, the Android 10, which may run on a Google Pixel device. But what Samsung and LG and Oppo and Huawei and others are doing, they take the stock operating system and they customize it into a different flavor, which is a different binary, if you like, that runs on the smartphone. You can see that Android 10, when it's running on a Samsung S20 Ultra device, it's actually One UI 2. And when it's running on S8 from Android 9 stock, it's One UI, and we go on and on. This is just a subset of the examples. This is why it's important to think about this head and long tail when you consider different devices, operating systems, mixing base and custom operating system flavors just to obtain the maximum coverage, again, in an optimized and data-driven fashion, but still you want to consider all these facts. And if you look at combining these 2 or 3 previous slides, you reach, and maybe it's a bit small, but when you can zoom into once you are after this webinar, you can see these are the top US smartphones and tablets based on usage and quality considerations in the US this quarter. And you can see that we divided them into essential and enhanced and extended. You can see the top 10 here, the remaining top 15 and other devices. And these are the top 32 smartphones and tablets in the United States that you want to consider testing, together with other characteristics, the recommended operating system, whether it's a custom OS or it's a stock OS, whether it's trending up or down, the release date, the screen configurations, the PPI, screen resolution, and screen size. All of these things matter. You have a responsive website that runs on both mobile and web. You have a native or a hybrid mobile applications. You need to care about these characteristics. You need to see how each device not just functions, but also performs against real environment conditions across these different configurations. That's the only way for you to keep up and test against what's really out there in the market. Now,
I think this is, I just want to add, I think this is part of why, I'm just going to talk you guys up a little bit in this, where I think these previous few slides really put a fine point on the fact that having the right partners in being able to, make these strategic choices, not just execute, is so important to being able to make the right data-driven decisions. To some extent, this, the raw data itself is something that I think a lot of folks on this webinar, or I'm sure most folks on this webinar, are smart enough to pick up and run with themselves. But it's the kind of thing that, one, changes with a lot of frequency and speed, and two, ultimately is so, the market is so fragmented in terms of devices, browsers, environments, geos, other details, that having, centralizing a lot of the drivers of understanding these priorities, and being able to kind of guide you through how they change so that your strategy and your prioritization set can update to be able to keep up with that, is often the kind of thing that, as you're thinking about what you keep in house and what you bring in a partner to help you with, this is the kind of thing that you should be thinking about, answering the question, frankly, of who is the resource out of my internal team or my set of partners that's going to have the best access to this data and the best way to process this data most quickly to help me make sure I'm making the right decisions.
Definitely. And with this explanation just, on the mobile phone, it makes us more, comfortable, and it actually makes the work easier for me to explain the exact same thing that is relevant for the web platforms, because as mentioned by myself and Erik in the beginning of this webinar, we are in a digital full transformation of the industry, which means you need to care about these details. These details can make the difference between revenues, business reputations, and many more. So as we've just showed you the top leading smartphones and tablets. And by the way, in our report, it's not just the US. We are covering 9 different geographies across continents. So you can get a very nice global test coverage recommendation, if you like, if you have a multi-geography application or website with different domains and stuff like that. This will definitely be of value to you. But looking at what's happening on the web isn't less fragmented. Okay, we have seen over the past few months another transformation that happened with Microsoft ditching the Edge browser and moving to the Chromium project. We are seeing shifts with Firefox and Chrome. Firefox from Mozilla moved to a monthly GA release of their browsers. So right now we are on Firefox 75. What we are seeing, and it's very important to mention that, is that the adoption and the updates to the latest Firefox releases is slower than if you look at what we see with Chrome. Chrome latest and latest -1 are the major operating systems used across Windows 10 and Mac. But if you look at Firefox, people aren't that fast to upgrade into this monthly cadence that Mozilla is making available. Safari is a bit fragmented, quite fragmented, if you may. And you see that Safari browsers, but also the Mac OS is quite distributed, actually forcing the responsive web developers in the audience and the testers, of course, to consider different permutations of Mac OS and Windows across all these different browsers and operating systems. And again, it's this data and what you see if you have the Adobe or other Google Analytics and you see the traffic coming in. You can also prioritize and make these head and long tails a bit more optimized to your needs. But at the end of the day, you do want to look at these trends to see how the users are adopting at what cadence, so you can build your both mobile and web test automation coverage and strategy. And you can look at, it's not a secret, okay? This is from the Mozilla wiki page. You can see what's coming in the upcoming 6 months. Mozilla aren't hiding any of their upcoming releases. You can see a monthly cadence of Firefox browsers being released. Google are doing the same. In the index report, you can see the PDF report that we have published, you can see Chrome, Firefox, Safari, Edge, and other upcoming releases. So the data is out there. You just need to focus and make sure that you are using these calendars and the market statistics as part of your testing strategy. Last but not least is your end users. I think that's the most important thing. You want to make sure that you are testing as close as possible to your end users. And this means you want to test against real user conditions. Maybe in mobile you will see a bit more characteristics or specifics because you see additional complexities like geographies that matters with location injections, network like 4G versus 5G, a lot of applications and interruptions that are happening, different languages which are kind of common across web and mobile, and other load conditions that are also common on web and mobile. And by the way, with the rise of progressive web applications, we are going to start seeing more of the same mobile-specific real user conditions kind of invading the web technologies. So progressive web can act as a mobile application just with a web characteristic. So it can listen to push notifications. It can engage with sensors like audio, GPS, and many more. So all of the things that I'm showing you right now are fully digital related and needs to be part of your test automation coverage strategy. So you do not need to remember everything. We have come up with a nice, I wouldn't call it a model, but kind of a persona-driven testing approach. And you can see here, let's say you have a responsive website or you have a mobile application. This can be in one slide your test bed, your test environment that you can think of. It includes different profiles. Different profiles means different users. Different users can be in different locations, which have different characteristics. Some of them are business users. Some of them are, other workers in different segments. They have different smartphones and tablets. They are operating in different network environments. And some of them are using the app in a different orientation. And obviously, based on their segment of or profile, you can see that they are using different background applications. For example, if Georgia she is a business person, obviously she's traveling a lot and she has a lot of emails and banking applications running all in the background. I've just created in one slide a test plan with a full test coverage for your application. So this is the power, if you like, of thinking test coverage with real user conditions in one single, slide. So just one last slide to finalize this section of platform coverage. And you have seen in the previous slide, I was talking about different locations with different personas that operate in different conditions. So as all of the data that I provided earlier is available, some of it is part of the Perfecto index report, some of it is just available online. This is taken from the Open Signal reports, also free reports conducted on a quarterly basis, covering almost any geography that you can think of. So this is taken for the US in Q1 2020, and you can see the differences in the performance of these carriers in the United States: Verizon, T-Mobile, AT&T, and Sprint. And you can see that not everyone performs the same on a specific metric or KPI. You can see that on the download speed experience, for example, AT&T is the winner, but on the video experience, Verizon is the winner. And why is that important? If you have an application that streams video or integrates with other video source like YouTube or whatever, you do want to have your test coverage considering both, or at least the top performer and the least performer from a carrier perspective on a mobile device, just so you understand the real end user experience in both edges of the KPI metrics, like OpenSignal are now are showing you in this slide. And it varies also through 5G and 4G and many more. So just tying this slide to the back or to the previous slide, talking about the different personas in different locations, use these reports, use this kind of resources to even or to double click on the insights that you think you have and just maximize the confidence in your test environment by covering the right operators in different geographies. Again, going from the top to the least performing carrier, just so you get, again, both sides of the story. With that, I want to move to the second part, or the second part of the coin, if you like, for the test automation coverage strategy, and this is about the scenarios. And this is a new way of looking at coverage. And I will hand it over to you for the next two slides, Erik, and you can take it from here.
Yeah, so something that I suspect a lot of folks on this webinar are familiar with is the testing pyramid. And this is something that the first time we ever saw it in the world, or at least that I'm familiar with, was a 2015 presentation by Google, which of course in software terms, we think of that like dog years. That was ages ago, and it's become an accepted standard of thinking about what kind of different functional tests we want to build for all software, but we think of this in terms of, web and mobile software. And I'll just review it real quick for those who are less familiar. So, this is a lot like the food pyramid, right? So everything at the top is eat sparingly, and at the bottom, it's like your vegetables and you want a lot of them. Unit tests, the recommendation is a very high number of them because they run quickly and they're cheap, right? You can run them on demand constantly. They consume very few resources. They're highly stable. They require very low maintenance. And generally speaking, it's accepted that unit tests are, part of just good software development as a whole. They make the code, forcing yourself to write unit tests makes your code better, right? So those are kind of an integral part of software development, large number of them. Integration and API tests. Their cost to build and maintain is a little higher. The execution time is a little higher. They're a little more fragile. We have fewer of them, and they test, between subcomponents. And then these end-to-end tests at the UI level, we want to actually have a very small number of those. And I think this is the part wherein, the many conversations I have that people can be a little bit uncomfortable with. And we'll talk about how to improve the comfort here. But one thing we all know is that, your conventional Selenium test suite, if it gets very large, it's highly unstable, requires a lot of people and a lot of time to be able to maintain it. And its runtime is huge. I think the longest running test suite end-to-end test suite I've seen working with prospects is, I think took 4 days to run. And that was even parallelized, right? That was parallelized as much as they could. And then kind of way at the top, we have exploratory testing, which is something that we still want to do, but it's the most expensive because it's fundamentally manual. It's necessarily manual, right? And therefore it's going to consume a high number of resources. It's totally unmaintainable. It's not scalable. And so this is kind of the recommended way, again, much like the food pyramid of thinking about, what kind of functional tests we should be deploying. Eran, anything you want to add to this?
No, I think that you touched everything, and the timing here, and you mentioned it earlier. You don't have, especially today, and when you talk about digital, you don't have the luxury of endless time, and obviously 4 days for a regression cycle is way too much.
Yeah.
In an iteration that takes a week or 2 weeks, it's almost half of the iteration is just regression. It makes no sense.
Exactly. And this is where, and I think this is where the true digital transformation that we're seeing, at least in my world, right? My world is all about functional web testing. And this is where I'm seeing software leaders and testing leaders struggle the most to make the transition. Is there was an old way when we had much longer development cycles, right? Kind of pre-agile, but certainly pre-continuous development or continuous deployment, right? So we might say, like, back in the day, right, we had much longer development cycles and therefore much longer test cycles. If we think far enough back, right, we were literally shipping stuff in compact disks, right? And what that meant was that it was hard to send updates, right? You ship a bug in a compact disk, you're in trouble. So the software development cycle was much slower, and the need for totally completionist testing before you deploy was much higher. Now, of course, that we can deploy hotfixes quickly, what that allows us to do is kind of succumb to the pressure of time to market and resource efficiency to deploy faster. We've moved down to 2-week sprints. A lot of ProdPerfect's customers are true continuous development, continuous deployment. And that software development strategy has given them a massive edge over their much slower competition. And what that has done is, it's the right thing for the business, but it's put a ton of pressure on testing leaders to find a way to fit this pyramid. And the part that people are least comfortable with is making that top of the pyramid small, because there's this feeling that folks have that if a certain feature or a certain feature set is not covered by end-to-end tests, then it's not tested well. When fundamentally, what we see on that arrow on the left there is that the return on investment for as many of our tests as we can is highest as we push them further down the pyramid into these tests that run faster and therefore can be run more frequently and have less maintenance costs, right? So our return is higher, our investment is lower on those kinds of tests. We still do need end-to-end tests, and because we want to make sure that the core functionality of the application has not broken down, right? This is where the kind of everything comes together. As a friend of mine who works at NASA said, your lower level tests are like testing the individual components, right? But fundamentally, you don't know that the Mars rover is going to work until you put it together, put it in a Mars-like environment, and drive it around. And that's what end-to-end testing is like. We should be doing a small amount of that at the end, at the end of the deployment's life cycle before it goes live. And so we want to keep this lean and mean and focus on what matters most to the user, right? This is going all the way back to the earlier slide about the customer experience is what matters. So let's test for what they care about. And
I think, Erik, what we are seeing right now on the slide, this is reality, okay? This is taken from one of our customers, and this is how his pipeline looks like. And what you can see here is that this is just one day. You were mentioning that you had an experience with a customer who was running 4 days of regression. Obviously, this isn't even close to what we are seeing here. In this example, which is an advanced pipeline, we see that a client is able to include a short smoke testing per each pull request. Is able to take 1 hour during the noon time where everyone is eating lunch and stuff like that to do a build acceptance testing of an hour, and he's getting fast feedback before 1 p.m. That's a 1 hour feedback loop here. And this is kind of a preliminary validation for the nightly regression that takes place each night. That's your regression earlier that you mentioned that is covering almost 80% of the platforms as well as the test automation scenarios, giving high confidence in the morning when these guys are back near their desks. So this is a nice daily pipeline activity that includes both developers, testers working together, cross feedback that is happening between developers, testers, all in one single resource. And this is, this is how good looks or should look like in my mind.
Yeah, I really love this model you brought, Eran, and kind of props to the customer of yours that built this. I think everyone should be taking notes on it. And the way that this all ties together is, everyone remember back to that head and tail curve that we saw, right? There are these three different builds, or these three different testing formats going on here that have, at the smoke a very small test suite, at the noon build a larger one, and a regression a much larger one. And what we're able to do is use the data that we get about how our users are using the application, and about what feature sets are high risk and high value and high importance, to prioritize which of our tests will be in the smoke suite, which in the noon build suite, and which in the regression suite here. So it's not that we're going to totally ignore stuff that's a little bit further down in the mid-tail. It's that we're going to run the mid-tail less frequently, right? And that top of the curve, where we have the most core functionality, the stuff that will shatter the user's experience, the stuff that will create a war room bug, right? That's the stuff that we know, because users really care about it, is the stuff that we should be testing constantly, that we shouldn't let a pull request merge if it's failing, and we should certainly never let it get to production. So those of you who are Men in Black fans will know the reference here, but the way that we can bring data into our end-to-end testing decision making here is pretty novel. And this is the way that ProdPerfect thinks about coverage. There are other ways of thinking about coverage vis-a-vis data, but I think our example will be inspiring for those who are new to it. So if we think about the old way that folks calculated coverage, right? I'll ask a prospect, hey, tell me about your test coverage right now. And they'll say, well, our end-to-end test coverage is 80%. And I'll say, okay, 80%. What's the denominator on that 80%, right? How do you measure it's 80% of what? And they say, oh, we've automated 80% of the test scenarios that we have created. It's like, oh, how did you determine what test scenarios you created? It's like, oh, well, we looked at our requirements and came up with what were our high priority scenarios, right? And so I'm beating a horse here a little bit, but if we, any percentage is a fraction, right? There's a numerator and a denominator. And the denominator on the kind of old way of thinking about test coverage is the test that we came up with, that a group of people came up with in a room. And if you recall, an earlier point that we made was that two different groups of smart test automation engineers would come up with two different sets of high priority tests. And therefore, that denominator is not objective, it's subjective. Right? And so one team's 80% may actually be worse than another team's 60%. Because one team may have just a much larger denominator than another, but as we know, we can't actually afford to have these very large denominators. We can't actually afford to have, thousands of end-to-end tests, or at times even hundreds of end-to-end tests. And therefore, what really matters is that our denominator of tests be the right denominator. Right, that we're measuring against the right metrics to be able to assess how well we're doing to cover our application scenarios. And so the way ProdPerfect thinks about it is we say, well, look, the denominator is all about the user, right? What are they doing? What do they care about? So what the way our product works is that we're collecting product analytics from our customer's application to understand to understand what users are doing, the way we measure our coverage is we take all of the user interactions that our tests are covering, from that data, and divide by the total number of user interactions that we've observed. So if we hit, for example, if that number was 50%, what it would mean is that for every interaction, for everything that a user is doing on the application, there's a 1 in 2 chance that we have end-to-end tests covering that, right? So if it was 80%, it would mean there's a 4 in 5 chance that the interaction is being covered. As you can imagine, the Pareto rule applies here so that we can develop a small number of tests that cover a very large number of interactions on the application because users have their own priorities of how they use the application. This way of measuring coverage allows us to use factual data to prioritize what tests we're going to write. And our metric of success is having that level of coverage, that objective user-centric level of coverage be high, while also maintaining a small enough number of tests that we can run this test suite frequently, that it's easy to maintain, and that it's not slowing down our time to market. So that's our way of thinking about of using this data to think about how well we're covering an application. Eran, anything you want to add?
No, I think it just goes back to the previous slides on time. You don't have time. You want to be focused, and you want to be also up to date all the time. So this is a very, very optimized and efficient approach of looking into test automation coverage, in opposed to like a maybe useless 4 days regression of everything that you can think of, which maybe doesn't make sense to your end users anymore.
Yes, exactly. And the worst thing about that 4 days regression is that they were talking to us because they were still missing a lot of critical bugs that were getting to production, right? And what was happening, they just kept throwing stuff against the wall, and they had kind of lost touch with what their users cared most about. A lot of this test suite had gotten stale and out of date. And it's very hard to update a test suite without seeing this data and how it evolves. And I'm actually going to get into how we think about it, right? Last thing I want to note here is that there is sophistication we can add to how you think about a coverage target that allows you to focus this a little bit better. So instead of just thinking about the entire application, what we're covering, we can balance for different user roles to make sure that lower frequency users are not getting swamped. So if you have a freemium product, right, you can filter and change this analysis by paying users to make sure that they're not getting swamped by the free user. You can cluster URLs to make sure that that certain feature sets are not getting ignored. And then we can also, over the long term, what we can do as a testing industry is we can add different weighting to this coverage calculation based on past experience to help us get a better sense of feature risk. And ultimately, the way that we do it, and that you could do it on your own, if you want to set it up in your own, your own shop, is, as mentioned, we're collecting Clickstream metadata, product analytics data. So this is a visualization of what our machine does under the hood, where we're seeing these nodes are events, and the arrows are people moving between those events. This is a very small, easy application. And what you'll need to do to be able to build the right test cases that focus on what your users are doing is use some heavy normalization and tracing algorithms through this data to be able to trace the most trodden paths, right? So the way I think of it is if you were to look at a park or like a green in a university, you'll sometimes see these like brown paths through the field where people are treading the most, right? Where they've walked through the field frequently. And so we're looking for those paths where users tread to understand what's the stuff that matters to them. How do they use the application? How do they care about it? And so we do that, what we're seeing on the left here is one such user's journey. And on the right here, we're seeing many user journeys overlaid to be able to build a picture of coverage, that's going to help us with these, or that's going to help us best test for the user. And then what we can ultimately do is prioritize exactly the way that we talked about. So remember that head and tail model we have. If we look at this lower curve, this yellow, Here's the head. And then we've got a very long tail where if we were to zoom in here, we would see these like very, very small bars. It turns out that most of the time, users use a fairly small, of all the possible things they can be doing, right? And if you think of a true random walk through your application, there may be millions of different orders by which the user can use the application. There are really a few that they're using repeatedly. And so what we can do is we can say, okay, we know this top curve is the cumulative look at what users have done. And so you can see here we've got 70 and 80% here. So we can actually use a fairly small number of tests. We're looking at order of 30 tests to cover 80% of what users do on an application. And this is a smaller application, but it's a massive level of coverage with a very small number of tests that allows us to get a great quality experience to our customers, a high level of quality assurance, with a low resource intensity, low maintenance intensity, and great run speed to allow us to run this test suite very frequently with, certainly sprint, 2-week sprint deploys, daily deployments, or even continuous deployments, right? So we've now brought our end-to-end test suite into a continuous deployment world that allows us to move quickly without breaking things. And this is the way, however you decide to approach using your product analytics data to inform your testing, this is the way this is the way such that if you think about it this way, you're going to be able to get the maximum ROI on that test suite. Eran, any thoughts before we move on?
I simply love this slide because I would add to the title of this slide not just prioritize, but also the word focus, because,
yes.
When you think about it, and I'm in my past, I used to be a director of QA, and I was leading a lot of QA teams, and I was always looking for data rather than just guessing which scenarios I should be testing. I didn't care about the size of my test suite. I cared about the value it can bring, and when you are able to focus on this, maybe 20% of the most important user journeys and add them into your build cycle through CI/CD, you are in a very good journey towards less escape defects, less risk in your product. And yeah, you can reprioritize and add your other long tail test cases into an end-to-end testing scenario every now and then. But in the nightly builds that you want to do, obviously I would recommend to focus on these short and very important user journeys that are data-driven by nature.
Absolutely.
So with that, we're approaching the end of this webinar. So if we want to put everything together, whatever myself and Erik were talking about in this webinar, you want to have a mix of platform coverage that is data-driven and test automation scenarios that are, again, as just we were wrapping up the previous slide, is very data-driven as well. When you have data-driven decision-making guiding your test automation coverage strategy, you are always, ahead of your end users. You're able to react, you're able to fix, you're able to prevent escape defects, and you're testing against what matters the most. So if you take just these 3 bullets out of this very insightful webinar, leverage market data from teams like ProdPerfect that can give you the most important user journeys in your website, in your product. Use different calendars or index reports like I mentioned earlier, so you are aware to what's happening in the market in different geographies. Continuously maintain and validate. Just carrying one test automation suite from one iteration to the next makes no sense. At the end of the day, you are going to end up with a very, very long list of test cases that aren't adding any value. You want to be always focusing on what's matters the most to your end users. You want to focus on the most used user journeys and features in the application, and these are the tests that you want to integrate or shift left into the CI/CD as we started this webinar. And last but not least, doing everything that we have just described in the webinar cannot be a single person or just a one-man show. It takes a team of developers, testers, business testers, product owners, everyone working together, aligning all the different objectives, priorities. We used a lot in this webinar the word priorities and optimization. I think that it needs to come as a full feature team or joint team objective or goal to make everything, continuously function based on, again, data and, focused decision making. With that, I just want to move to the last slide around analytics and let you wrap up this webinar, Erik.
Yeah, thank you. The way that you use data is going to depend on its function. And there are two sources that you can get this data from, and they work very differently. And you should think about which source or how can I integrate both of these sources to be able to help me make these decisions. So in particular for testing regression on your own application, right? You have that data from your users' usage. So how do your users use your application? What scenarios do they go through? What browsers do they use? What devices do they use? What does their environment look like? You have that data, and it's going to teach you how to make sure that the current functionality and the current customer experience that they love so much doesn't get broken by future updates. Of course, when you're looking forward, you don't have that data yet. So if you're building new feature sets, you're building, you're expanding your product, you're expanding your target market, you're expanding it to new geographies, right? You don't have that data from your users yet because you either haven't gotten the users or they haven't used the features. And the way that you're going to be able to use data to guide what you're testing for the future the rest of the market can inform you there. And so for, providers and partners like Perfecto, who are experts in the market, who have access to all this data, who have many, many customers who are like you, right? These kinds of partnerships end up being extremely valuable to help guide you on what's the most likely way that your users are going to be interacting with your application to prepare you to test these new features, new geos, new experiences, new customer bases effectively.
Awesome. With that, I just want to thank you, Erik, for joining this webinar. Before we move to the Q&A section, it was a pleasure to deliver this session with you. And not by any chance, you have the word perfect in your product name, and we are Perfecto, so the match is obviously clear to me.
Yes.
With the short time that we have, Shelby, can we just at least get 2 or 3 questions addressed?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. The first question is, doesn't usage frequency fall short as a coverage metric? We normally approach testing by covering features, and I feel like this approach would miss a lot of what's important.
Yes. Maybe I can take this one first, Eran. I think this is the core question to grapple with, almost like philosophically to both it's kind of conversations we need to have with our prospects all the time, but I think it's also fundamentally, no matter what approach you take, is the question you need to grapple with, which is, if I could restate it, it's sort of like, it's that, hey, let's say we're Salesforce here, right? We've got a massive sprawling application that has so many different things that can be tested, so many different scenarios that can be tested, probably a billion different device browser combinations that can be tested. And so is using frequency, usage frequency data, is it sufficient? And I want to say yes, if you go far enough down, far enough down the tail, it can be complete. Because ultimately, I think I want to make the case here. And again, this is somewhat philosophical, but if you have for any feature set that's live, like if users aren't using it, you shouldn't bother testing it. And if users are using it very infrequently, then you should be testing it infrequently. If users are using it extremely frequently, you should be testing it extremely frequently. And I think in particular, the reason I feel so strongly about this is that is we have to go back to that testing pyramid. And I think this question comes from that like discomfort I talked about from embracing the fact that, we have to treat end-to-end tests. Actually, I'll go back to that. We have to treat end-to-end tests like, fats and oils and sweets on our food pyramid, is that we have to use them sparingly. And the thing I see go wrong so often is that, hey, we're going to do a quote from our features or from our requirements approach, is that the requirements list doesn't fundamentally prioritize itself, right? So I end up seeing, if you want to test all of your features, you will have a test suite that takes 4 days to run. If you're Salesforce and you want to test all your features, it will take weeks to run. And I think we just have to embrace that that's not an option for us to be able to, for us to be able to like move at the speed that we need to move to in the new kind of digital and emerging continuous deployment era. And I think that's just like it is hard to embrace that after, if you spent 10 or 20 years, running with like large, takes days to run test suites. But I think it's the way that, the business as a whole, gets to use its resources in the most effective way. Eran, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, I think that's perfect. That's a very complete answer. I hope that the guy that asked it got what he was expecting. Any other questions that we have time for?
Yep, we have one last question that we have time for.
Okay.
How can I maintain both my test automation suite coverage as well as my lab and environment as a continuous process?
Ooh.
Okay, I would just say it in one word, which was repeated so many times during this webinar: data. You can't maintain continuously your test automation scenarios, the scope of the test automation scenarios, as well as the platforms without seeing it, without visualizing it, without having the data. Once you have data, making data-driven decisions is obviously the recommended approach. And once you see which platforms are mostly used by your end users, which user journeys, as Erik was describing earlier, are being used by your end users, combining both continuously, this is the only way to be successful in a very short time, in an optimized fashion, and also in a cost-efficient way as well.
Yes.
And anything to add on that, Erik?
The only thing I'd add is I think the most fundamental difficulty for humans, and this gets like a little deep, but the hardest thing we do as humans is letting go. We're just not good at it. And succeeding at this constant, to Eran's point, we have to constantly refresh this data and relearn from it and reprioritize. And being able to do that successfully means we have to have the courage to let go. And so it means that like some of the devices and browsers in our lab get shifted out further right along the tail as new ones emerge. As we develop new features, certain features are going to, in certain scenarios and workflows are going to be pushed further right along the tail. And having the courage to say at some point, this test either gets, this test or this part of my lab setup, gets demoted to be run less frequently or gets shut down and not run anymore at all. That courage having that courage is like key to being able to efficiently and incisively pursue the strategy that Eran just described, and it's something that takes a lot of mettle from leadership to be able to do right.
Totally agree. With that, I would just, again, like to thank you, Erik, for joining us. This was a very, very insightful webinar in my mind. And I thank all of you guys online that joined us. Feel free to continue the conversation with us offline through email, social, or whatever channel that you choose. And have a wonderful day. Again, thank you, Erik.
Yeah, can't wait to follow up with everyone. Eran, a pleasure as always. Thanks so much for inviting me. Everyone that was on, I hope you enjoyed, hope you found it useful, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.